The Lamborghini turned onto Chandler Hills Drive a little after 6 in the evening, its deep matte green paint catching the last of the summer light as it slowed and pulled into the driveway of the house at number 47. A modern, glass-fronted property with a 3-car garage and a lawn manicured to the particular uniform perfection that every house on this street seemed to share. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a plain white blouse and dark slacks, sunglasses pushed up into close-cropped natural hair, her posture relaxed in the unhurried way of someone arriving home after a long day, rather than someone doing anything even remotely out of the ordinary. She parked, stepped out, and walked toward the front door with her keys already in hand. By the time she reached the porch, 2 separate calls had already been placed to the county's non-emergency dispatch line.
"Yeah, hi, I want to report something suspicious," the first caller said. A man named Gary Prentice, who lived 3 houses down and had watched the entire sequence unfold from his own driveway while pretending to check his mailbox. "There's a black woman who just pulled into the driveway at 47 Chandler Hills in a Lamborghini. I don't recognize her, and I know for a fact the Hendersons who live there drive an Audi and a Range Rover. Might be worth having someone swing by." The second call, placed 4 minutes later by a neighbor 2 doors down named Deborah Alcott, carried an even more specific accusation. "I think someone's trying to steal a car, or maybe rob the house. There's a woman in workout clothes who just walked right up to the front door of 47 like she owns the place, and that Lamborghini definitely wasn't there an hour ago." Neither caller had bothered to ring the doorbell themselves. Neither had considered, even briefly, that a woman parking a car in her own driveway and walking to her own front door might simply be exactly what it appeared to be. What both calls shared, unmistakably, was the same unexamined leap: an expensive car, a black woman behind the wheel, and an instant, unquestioned conclusion that something about the combination required immediate police intervention. Officer Casey Whitlock took the call 14 minutes later, arriving at Chandler Hills with the particular keyed-up alertness of an officer responding to a possible burglary in progress, a framing that both 911 operators had passed along based entirely on the caller's own characterization rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The woman, Renata Ashford, though Whitlock hadn't yet bothered to learn her name, was standing in her own kitchen, unpacking a grocery bag when the knock came at her front door. She opened it to find a young officer standing on her porch, hand resting near his holster, posture tense in the particular way officers carry themselves when they believe they've arrived at something dangerous. "Ma'am, I've had a report of a possible break-in at this address. I need you to step outside and show me some identification." "This is my house, officer. I'd be happy to get you my ID, but I'd like to understand what specifically prompted this call first." "A neighbor reported someone who doesn't match the residents of this address arriving in a vehicle that doesn't match the residents' usual cars." Renata's expression didn't shift into anger. Not yet, though something in it sharpened. The particular, weary recognition of a scenario she had encountered, in various forms, more times across her life than she cared to enumerate, on her own front porch. "I've lived at this address for 6 years. My name is on the deed. The Lamborghini is mine, purchased 8 months ago. And I'd invite you to check the registration, which I can retrieve for you right now, if you'll allow me back inside for a moment. I need you to stay where I can see you while I verify that." "That's reasonable. My ID and the vehicle registration are both in my purse, on the kitchen counter, about 10 feet behind me." Whitlock hesitated. The particular, stubborn momentum of a man who had arrived expecting to find exactly the kind of confirmation his dispatch call had primed him for, and who found the calm, precise specificity of her answers considerably less satisfying than the version of events he'd been prepared to encounter. "I'm going to need you to step out here on the porch while I get back up to help sort this out." "Officer, I have committed no crime, and I am standing in my own home. I don't believe you have grounds to detain me on my own property based entirely on an anonymous neighbor's assumption about which car I'm allowed to drive." "Ma'am,
I'm not trying to make this difficult, but I do need to verify the situation, and that means I need you to cooperate." She studied him for a long moment, weighing, with the particular deliberate patience of a woman who understood exactly how badly this could go if handled wrong, and who had decided, for reasons she was not yet ready to share, to let the situation play out a little further before intervening in the way she was fully capable of intervening. "I'll step outside," she said finally. "But I want you to remember Officer Whitlock." She read the name off his badge with a precision that should have registered as a warning. "That I gave you every reasonable opportunity to handle this correctly before it went any further." Part 2. Backup arrives. By the time the second patrol car pulled up to the curb at 47 Chandler Hills, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered at a careful, curious distance. Gary Prentice among them, watching from his own driveway with the particular, self-satisfied posture of a man who believed his suspicion was about to be vindicated. Renata stood on her own porch, arms crossed, her expression calm but unmistakably tightening with each passing minute, while Whitlock and his newly arrived partner conferred near the cruiser, running her license through a system that would, within seconds, confirm every detail she had already stated plainly and without hesitation. Registered owner of the address, registered owner of the vehicle, no warrants, no history of any kind that could remotely justify the scene now unfolding on her own front lawn. "Everything checks out clean," the second officer said, scrolling through the results on his terminal. "Address matches. Vehicle registration matches her name." "Then I'd like my identification returned," Renata said. "And I'd like an explanation for why 2 separate neighbors felt compelled to report me for the crime of parking in my own driveway." Whitlock, visibly uncomfortable now, handed back her license without quite meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. We have to follow up on any report we receive." "I understand you have a duty to respond to calls. What I don't understand is why a woman got out of an expensive car and walked to a house, registered, in 2 separate neighbors' minds, as inherently suspicious enough to warrant a police response, rather than simply prompting either of them to knock on my door themselves, the way an actual concerned neighbor might." Neither officer had an answer for that, because the honest answer, that Gary Prentice and Deborah Alcott had arrived at their conclusion the moment they registered her race, rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing, was not one either officer particularly wanted to say out loud on a suburban lawn with several neighbors still watching. It was at that exact moment that a black SUV turned onto Chandler Hills Drive, moving with a purposeful, unhurried authority that made both officers straighten reflexively before they'd even registered why. The vehicle parked, and the man who stepped out of it, silver-haired, in his 60s, wearing a suit that carried the particular understated quality of someone who had worn dress uniforms for most of his career and had simply translated that same bearing into civilian clothes, walked toward the scene with an expression that shifted the moment he registered Renata standing on her own porch surrounded by 2 patrol cars, from mild concern into something considerably sharper. "Renata." He climbed the porch steps in a few long strides. "What happened?" "A misunderstanding, Frank, though I'd stop short of calling it entirely innocent." She gestured toward Whitlock. 2 of my neighbors reported me for stealing my own car in front of my own house." Deputy Chief Frank Alvarez, the county's second-ranking law enforcement official, and a man both officers on the scene recognized instantly, turned to face them with a controlled, deliberate calm that carried far more weight than raised anger would have. "Do either of you understand who you just detained on her own front porch?" Whitlock's mouth opened, then closed, the particular sinking realization of a man who had arrived expecting to confirm a burglary and had instead, somehow, ended up standing in front of his own department's second-highest-ranking official without having asked her name properly at any point in the last 20 minutes. "This is Commissioner Renata Ashford," Alvarez said, "head of this county's Police Oversight Commission, sworn in 8 months ago.
Around, I'd note, the same time she purchased the vehicle currently parked in her own driveway, that apparently prompted this entire response. Part 3. What 2 phone calls revealed. The story that unfolded over the following weeks did not center, in the end, on Officer Whitlock's conduct alone, a factor investigators would ultimately determine had been within the bounds of ordinary, if overly credulous, response to a dispatched call, however poorly he'd handled the details once he arrived. It centered instead on the 2 911 calls themselves, and on a question Commissioner Ashford, once she'd had a day to compose her thoughts, insisted on pursuing with a rigor that surprised several members of her own oversight commission. "I want to be careful about what conclusion we draw from this," she told the commission during an emergency session convened the following week. "The officers who responded to my house did nothing that violated department policy in the strict sense. They received a report alleging a possible break-in, and they responded to verify it. The failure isn't primarily theirs. It's upstream of them, in the 2 calls that generated the response in the first place, and in a dispatch system that apparently doesn't distinguish between an actual observed crime and a caller's unexamined assumption about who belongs in an expensive car." She had pulled, in the days following the incident, the full dispatch log for her district covering the preceding 18 months, a review made possible, and considerably more urgent, by her own position, and found a pattern that troubled her considerably more than her own encounter had. In the past 18 months, this district received 11 separate calls describing almost exactly what happened at my house. A resident, disproportionately black, engaged in some entirely ordinary activity at their own home, reported as suspicious by a neighbor who, in every single case, made no attempt to simply ask a question before dialing 911. 9 of those 11 calls resulted in an officer response. 4 resulted in the resident being asked to produce identification on their own property. That is not a series of isolated misunderstandings. That is a pattern. And it existed for 18 months before it happened to involve someone with the standing to make this commission actually look at it. The commission's subsequent review, conducted over the following 3 months, led to a policy change that generated considerably more public debate than Renata had initially anticipated. A new dispatch protocol requiring 911 operators to ask callers reporting suspicious activity at a residence whether they had made any attempt to directly verify the situation, a knock on the door, a wave, a simple question, before an officer would be dispatched for anything short of an explicitly witnessed crime in progress. Gary Prentice and Deborah Alcott, the 2 neighbors whose calls had prompted the response at Renata's house, faced no formal penalty. The department's legal counsel advised that no ordinance existed to sanction good faith 911 calls, however poorly founded. And Renata herself, despite the anger the incident had understandably generated, declined to pursue the matter as anything beyond the policy question it had revealed. "I don't believe punishing 2 neighbors accomplishes what actually needs accomplishing here," she said, in the single public statement she gave about the incident, standing on the same porch where the encounter had unfolded. "What needs to change isn't Gary Prentice's private assumptions about who's allowed to own a Lamborghini. What needs to change is a system that treats those assumptions as sufficient grounds for a police response, without ever asking whether anyone bothered to check first." My neighbors made a call based on nothing but what they saw and what they assumed. The problem isn't that they're uniquely bad people. The problem is how ordinary that instinct is, and how little friction currently exists between having it and having armed officers show up at someone's front door because of it. 6 months later, Commissioner Ashford reviewed the first full report generated under the district's new dispatch protocol, sitting in the same kitchen where she'd been unpacking groceries the evening 2 of her neighbors decided her own home looked suspicious enough to report. The numbers told a clear story. Suspicious activity calls involving residential addresses had dropped by nearly 1/3 across the district. Not because fewer people were having the same unexamined instinct Gary Prentice and Deborah Alcott had acted on, but because the simple, mandatory question, "Have you tried verifying this yourself first?" had proven remarkably effective at interrupting the reflex before it escalated into an armed response. She still drove the Lamborghini, still parked it in the same driveway, still walked the same path to her own front door most evenings after work. Though she'd noticed, in the months since the incident, that Gary Prentice had taken to offering a small, awkward wave whenever their paths crossed near the mailboxes. Not quite an apology, but something adjacent to one. The particular, halting gesture of a man who understood, in some inarticulate way, exactly what his phone call had nearly cost a woman who had done nothing wrong, except park a car he didn't expect to see, in a driveway he'd decided, without ever asking, didn't belong to her. "I think about the 11 calls in that dispatch log more than I think about my own," she told the local reporter, in the closing line of the single interview she gave on the subject. 10 other residents went through some version of what happened to me, without a deputy chief showing up to end it in 5 minutes. I got a policy changed because of what happened on my porch. I'd like it understood that the 10 people before me deserved that same outcome, and got it only because, for once, the 11th call happened to land on a driveway belonging to someone the system couldn't afford to simply move past. The end.